in human rights and liberties, basically liberalization. So what the hell happened? Well, here's what happened. It was infectious disease changes that began in the 20s that led to all these liberals in the West in the 60s and 70s. And these infectious disease changes are well
the control of infectious diseases like malaria.
Yeah, bigger than that. It started out in 1920 with fluorinated water. That started in the West. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the West. The rest of the world didn't change. They didn't go through the social revolution. Many places in the world still haven't, because of disease levels are high. All of Africa, basically, much of Asia. But 1920s, chlorinated water started in the West and quickly spread throughout the Western world. By the Western world, I mean US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, those places. So chlorinated water, and that knocked out lots and lots of infectious disease. Put a little chlorine in public water. Also in the 20s began some systematic garbage collection. Before, people just threw the garbage out in their alley. Sewage treatment plants started then too, and there was more indoor plumbing starting in the 20s. Now let's jump to the 40s. 40s, big changes with regard to emancipation from parasites. Had child vaccination programs that began in the 40s. Also antibiotics, first good antibiotics right after World War II, 1945, in the 40s. So this was really, by that point, a new world in terms of lowered infectious disease compared to the world that all generations of humans had experienced in the West prior to those 20s and 40s. There were some antibiotics in the 30s, but sulfa drugs and so forth, but they had terrible side effects. So the real good antibiotics didn't come along until the 40s, and broad spectrum kind of antibiotics. And of course, that spread so rapidly that the use of antibiotics that they quickly saw resistance to antibiotics popping up, the evolution of resistance and parasites.
Yes, which is a serious problem we have now, because we have diseases that are resistant to almost all the broad spectrum antibiotics, even in combination. That's a looming catastrophe, which we should obviously pay attention to.
Right. Arms race between the parasites and the drug companies now with that. So up to the 40s. And then also in the 40s, you had insecticides coming along. Good insecticides, chlorinated hydrocarbons and organophosphate insecticides that killed pest species, including mosquitoes. So vectors, important vectors of disease in the West, mosquitoes. So they knocked out malaria, knocked out yellow fever with that, and so all that was going on to emancipate people. And then a generation or two later, you get the rise of liberalism throughout the West. So all these liberal young people growing up in a relatively disease-free environment by all these health interventions became the hippies and so forth.
They were healthy enough to be free.
Yeah.
And so that does really raise the question again of what this COVID pandemic and the lockdown is going to do to the political temperament of the West, or the world for that matter. But it's a particular change in the West because we're not accustomed to this sort of thing anymore.
Right.
So it's so interesting because, of course, I've thought of the liberalism revolution being a secondary derivative of the birth control pill, which was a biological revolution of immense magnitude, but I hadn't ever considered in depth. Even after reading your work,
I mean, the use of birth control and all that by women, that takes some willingness to try new things.
Right, exactly. Well, that's it. That might be dependent itself on.
That's way away from tradition, taking birth control.
So there's another perverse implication of the theory that you've developed too, which is that conservatism insistence upon hygiene and disease prevention is a precondition for liberalism. If it's successful, right? So it's in some sense, the conservatives are battling off the disease so that people can stay healthy. But the consequence of that is as soon as that they're healthy, they become liberal.
Yeah.
God, isn't that something?
Yeah. Well, I think you can look at it like this. So if you got high conservatism in a place, then those conservatives are doing things that promote, they're not using modern technology. They're not, open to new ideas. They're not open to science and all that. So those are attitudes that help the infectious disease, really.
Right. So their reliance on traditional.
That's right. Traditionalism
is also an impediment, tremendous impediment.
Yeah, it reduces their contact immediately. So it works against them that way. I mean, if you're not, pro-science and open to new ideas and innovations and all that kind of stuff, that has tremendous limitations. And so, you don't even put in septic tanks and anything like that, or chlorinate the water, or
so another
vaccination. You don't get a vaccination.
Right. Well, okay. So let's talk about two things then. One is, I've been struck, and tell me what you think about this. The COVID has become a politicized issue in Canada and in the US, but it doesn't seem to have happened the way you might have predicted if you were relying on parasite stress theory, because it seems to be that the conservative types are the ones who are objecting most strenuously to the lockdowns and to the inoculations, whereas the liberal types, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but seem to be more in favor of restrictions of movement and so on. And that actually, I can't get my head around that exactly.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is the pattern, and that's been studied now. And there's some papers on it. And here's what's going on. I think in the U.S. in particular, the conservative government at the time, when COVID was getting off the ground, the Trump administration was very negative about COVID. I mean, he called it a hoax and all that, didn't believe it, and no problem. And so that is the authority. We need to talk about authoritarianism, because this is where it comes in. You have the king, Donald Trump, saying that it's no problem. This disease is no problem. And it's just going to go away. It's a hoax and all that kind of stuff. And that is the word from God, basically, to highly liberal